Okay, at this time, I'd like to reconvene the hearing and continue by inviting our second panel of witnesses to please come up to the witness table. This panel includes Mr. McConnell, who was up on the first panel. It also includes Mr. Richard Kasich, the Deputy Director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Ms. Lieback will come back again. She is the manager of the field office here in Los Alamos for NNSA. And Mr. Michael Thompson, who is the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Major Modernization Programs for the National Nuclear Security Administration. And to Mr. Kasich and Mr. Thompson, who are both up here for the first time, I thank you very much for making yourselves available to us tonight. And if any of the panelists wish to submit a written statement for the record, we would certainly be happy to take that. So as previously done in the first session, the board will ask questions of the panel members, but any other panel member who would like to be recognized to either supplement an answer or to answer in place, you may certainly do that. So at this time, we will begin with a question from Mr. Hamilton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address the topic of inventory limits in the plutonium facility, and we'll start with Mr. Kasich. The Department of Energy's hierarchy of safety controls states that the minimization of hazardous material is the first priority. The approved safety basis limits the quantity of nuclear material at risk on the first floor of PF4 to 1.8 metric tons. That's 1,800 kilograms of plutonium-239 equivalent curies. But we know that many hundreds of kilograms have not been used or moved in the first floor for several years. Based on the current programmatic needs, can you give me a sense of the lowest value that the inventory limit could be while continuing to meet the mission requirements?
Appreciate that question, Commissioner Hamilton. I don't think there's any particular opportunity for significant lowering of the limit as it exists today, and that is in part reflective of the uncertainties in the mission requirements and some of the other factors that govern it. What I think is more relevant is the fact that notwithstanding whatever limit exists, the laboratory is constantly looking for opportunities to minimize the material that is actually at risk, notwithstanding the fact that we might be 5% below the limit or 20% below the limit or any figure you want to throw out. So the various activities that we have underway for some time and are continuing in terms of improved utilization of the vault in PF4, improved use of containers that are both have a very low damage ratio or minimum amount of material that could leave, as well as ergonomically friendly to our operators, and other methods that we've had undertaken for some time is what we will continue to do. And the lower we can make it and continue to execute the mission, that's what we'll do.
Okay, thank you. And just for the general public, I want to point out that when I say on the first floor, I don't mean literally on the floor. I mean in containers or in components or units that are located on the first floor of the building. So, Ms. Lieback, given that there's got to be some difference between safety basis limit and actual inventory levels, can you tell us how NNSA validates the safety basis inventory limits and what further reductions of the safety base limit might be pursued?
Okay, thank you. We've actually reduced the limits over time, and they've come down substantially over time. And we also look at operations on a case-by-case basis, and we can impose lower limits if we so desire for a certain type operation, and we do that. The laboratory uses tracking systems in the facility to track material at risk or containers and other type of material flow throughout the facility. And we have the ability to conduct oversight at any time on any of the processes in the building, and we often do. And so we have looked at some of their tracking systems recently, and we've looked at it from a quality assurance standpoint. And although we found that overall the systems are being used as they're intended to be used, I think in session one we talked about some areas that we could possibly improve, or in our previous discussions. For example, our database that the lab uses, could be expanded a little bit to put some more factors into the database. But we have had a couple of issues that we brought to the laboratory's attention, and they are working to correct some of the issues, but those came through some of the quality assurance oversight that we've conducted in the facility as a course of our normal, the way we normally operate from a field office perspective. So we actually have facility representatives in the facility, in the PF4 facility. We have 3 trained individuals right now. They go through about 18 months of training. And then we also have subject matter experts who can do assessments or conduct oversight of the nuclear operations. And we have an assessment schedule. We schedule the work, and then we conduct the assessments, and we provide feedback to the laboratory. And so we have done that in the instance of the inventory tracking system, but it was not a deficiency that required an immediate action. It was a lower level deficiency.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Liebeck, and thank you, Mr. Kasich. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. Thompson, welcome. As the Assistant Deputy Administrator for Major Modernization Programs, you have responsibilities around the complex for NNSA. And at Y12, there's been a concept that developed that refers to, uses the phrase just-in-time material at risk.
Yes, sir.
In order to try to minimize the material at risk that is in some aging facilities at Y12. So if you would, if you could just briefly elaborate first on what that program is. And again, we're talking about the Y12 site in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. But that's a lead-in, because then I'd like you to address whether that concept can translate to here at Los Alamos, and if elements of it can't, just explain why it might not.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. To your point, Y12 has been on the forefront of just-in-time inventory concepts and practices for their nuclear material inventory, which is primarily uranium, different form than plutonium here at Los Alamos. They have, over time, had to deal with a number of aging facility issues, much like we're talking about with PF4, actually, with facilities that are even more dated. And as a result of that, they have looked at creative ways within the rules and regulations that we have, and to minimize how much inventory working needs to be dealt with on a daily basis, and containerizing as much as possible, as was said in the first panel. To first principle, I think that some of those concepts that they have implemented for uranium can work for the plutonium arena here at Los Alamos. I think one of the challenges is for us, as it was stated in the first panel, we do expect in the future that our mission requirements will increase to levels of production for pits in particular that we have not seen before at PF4, and because of that, I think there will be there'll be a gradual ramp in our production capability over the next decade or so. we have time. The good news is we have time to learn some of those lessons and apply them where they make sense to plutonium. So much so that only a few months ago, we asked Los Alamos and Y-12 experts to form a joint body where they're actively exchanging ideas. We have a plutonium manager in headquarters and a uranium manager, both working in my organization. And they have field office experts and subject matter experts from the laboratory and plant that are regularly meeting now to exchange some of those early concepts and ideas so we can learn from each other essentially across the enterprise as to how to improve.
Thank you. So at Y-12, they have a very new facility that's referred to by its acronym HEUMF that
Yes.
allows for storage outside of the aging facilities. And currently, there is no such facility here at Los Alamos. Does any of that enter into any of the discussions, say, with the potential we heard early in the first panel about modules and
Yes, sir.
potentially moving things out of the PF4 in the future?
Certainly.
Is this some type of function that a module might be used for in the future?
Yes, sir. It is part of the broad analysis of alternatives being considered. And just as background for the public, previous concepts in the CMR nuclear facility that was intended to be one large footprint included a large storage vault. We have done a lot of work, as was stated in the first panel, to reduce the material at risk in PF4. However, looking forward, I think a module could be dedicated to storage as a way to reduce some of the higher risk in PF4.
Thank you. And does the fact that there are actually these different programs that do involve, say, NASA, and there's some work in there that's done for Department of Homeland Security, or, does that complicate the ability of NNSA to try to manage plutonium as opposed to, say, Y-12, which is pretty much an NNSA-only managed operation?
No, sir. I defer to maybe Mr. Kasich as well for his view, but I would say that actually is not a constraint, but a benefit, because what we find is that capability, that the set of capabilities that the laboratory has at PF4 that represent not only the technical experts, but the specialized equipment and the facility itself, are a unique capability. And in our world, for defense-related reasons, it's not necessarily just a part of the nuclear deterrent. It's actually an active part of the deterrent. And so everything that we do in those other mission areas that you mentioned for NASA and for other agencies, what we find is we have that capability that is primarily geared and focused on weapons work. However, that expertise and those specialized equipment sets can be used for other uses, and many times there is a active learning curve for the subject matter experts in the facility that we can leverage for other things that the nation needs.
All right, Mr. Kasich, did you care to add? Mr. Thompson invoked your name.
I heard that, yes. I have little to add with that. I certainly agree with what he said. I think to your point, I would just observe that the more parties that you have involved in any given enterprise, interfaces, tend to be an area of some complexity that takes some additional work to manage. And I think that was implicit in your question. But other than that, I think Mr. Thompson addressed it well.
All right, thank you. All right, Ms. Connery.
So, Mr. McConnell, the 2017 Stockpile Stewardship and Management Plan describes the plutonium facility as playing an important role in the stockpile stewardship strategy. Specifically, it requires LANL to start producing qualified plutonium pits in the year 2021 and increasing pit manufacturing capacity to 50-plus pits by 2030. This comes from the National Defense Authorization Act of 2015 that requires DOE to demonstrate the capability to producing 50 to 80 pits per year in 2027. However, in 2015, the Congressional Research Service found that LANL had not rigorously determined the amount of material needed to support its pit manufacturing mission, nor has any such determination been communicated to us. How does NNSA determine how much special nuclear material is needed to meet the planned pit production capacity, and how does this affect the ultimate inventory goal for the plutonium facility?
Thank you very much. I have some thoughts. I think Mr. Thompson probably has some insights that you would benefit from also. First off, as you indicated, we have been directed by Congress and by other national authority to ramp up through production. This is as Mr. Thompson said, would require Los Alamos and the plutonium facility to engage in pit production at a level that they've not done before, a level that the country hasn't done in quite some time. So there is a learning curve that we're all going to have to go through, and so part of the reason to have these intermediate milestones of 10 pits, 20 pits, 30 pits on the way to 50 to 80 pits is for us all collectively to understand better what it actually requires to make high-quality pits at that level of output, what it means everything from material demands to sort of classic industrial engineering, what is the process throughput through the manufacturing factory that could get to those levels of production, to how do we ensure we can do that safely and securely, how do we make sure we have the talented, skilled workforce that's necessary to do all of that. I think we'd all be fooling ourselves if we said we had a really good crystal ball right now that said we knew exactly how those things were going to come out as we progress from 10 to 20 to 30 pits. But what we will surely do, and what we are pretty confident right now, is that our regulatory threshold for how much material we can have, this limit in the documented safety analysis that Ms. Lieback has approved, sets on the main floor. So when we talk about the main floor, when we talk about glove boxes and the day-to-day work of the facility, it happens on this first or main floor. We have a limit for that. We don't operate close to that limit. We operate with a margin. So we on any day-to-day basis, the amount of actual material that is on the first floor in the facility or that we're working with is less than our regulatory analyzed level. And we believe that even in the future with these larger throughputs, that the actual inventory will still remain less than the current regulatory threshold. So the safety systems and the analysis, which are based on that number, will still remain valid. But I think Mr. Thompson could probably add some additional detail for you.
Thank you. Yes, the only thing I would add is, in addition to what Mr. McConnell said, is all of the current analysis that was done in 2008, which was the last time the site-wide environmental impact statement was done, analyzed for that 50 to 80 pits per year production that you mentioned, Ms. Connery. So we feel confident that we are appropriately bounded in terms of our current operations and our path forward to get to those higher levels of pit production. Having said all that, we are undergoing now, and I can defer to Ms. Lieback for more detail, a supplemental analysis process to make sure that those analyses that were done in 2008 are still valid for the missions that we have going forward.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying that you don't anticipate to challenge the limits that are already set for PF4 in terms of the material at risk. In the event that you did challenge that limit and had to raise it, what would the process be and how would the public be informed that that limit was raised?
So in the last session, we talked about a way we maintain our documented safety analysis current called an unreviewed safety question. If something that is a fundamental assumption or analytical technique of our current safety basis is either found to have been an error or challenged by our expectations going forward, then we invoke a process where we go back through the entire process of making sure we know what the hazard is, because if we had to raise that number, the hazard would be greater. understanding then what the accidents are that could result from that, what the consequences of those accidents would be, and therefore what controls are available that we would want to rely on that would interrupt that accident to show we had adequate protection. It could be that we would end up needing to put additional controls in place. It could be that we would have to offset the risk of increased pit production by figuring out how to reduce the integrated risk of some other part of PF4 through, for example, lower limits or more containerization, or even through the AOA, perhaps moving other process lines out of PF4 into some other construct. But at the end of the day, that would put us into what we would call a positive unreviewed safety question. So the laboratory would have the obligation to go back and do a whole new holistic analysis that would come to the government for review and validation that would ultimately end in a new approval by the field office manager of a new safety basis and a new set of controls.
If I might add, Mr. Thompson mentioned the site-wide environmental impact statement. The record of decision stated that the site could produce up to 20 pits per year, so we do have a follow-on NEPA activity that he mentioned. We are going to look at a supplement analysis, and we have processes through the NEPA Act where we can notify the public of those analyses, of the NEPA analyses.
And if you would permit me to also add to that, and in agreement with Mr. McConnell's judgment about the likelihood of the existing limit being sufficient, as you have heard, we do have a number of capital construction projects, some well on their way and others contemplated. And coupling that with the improved use of the vault and safes and containers and so forth, I think there's ample reason to have that confidence.
Thank you.
Mr. Santos?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the specific opportunities to reduce risk by reducing the quantity of material at risk. So if I may ask Mr. Kasich, could you provide us with an estimate of the percentage of special nuclear material that sits in certified containers today with low damage ratios?
I think I might need to get some help on that one. I don't recall a good answer to that offhand. I'm sorry. Even my colleagues.
I don't think we would want
Yeah.
to venture a guess and get it wrong. Can we take that question?
we
And we'll
take
get to
that?
the particulars.
Okay. Following on that, do you have a kind of a master schedule or goal for a percentage of items you're looking for to have containerized?
Well, I think I would point to what's been accomplished over the last several years, where the degree of reduction in MAR since 2009 is on the order of 60%. So I think that provides one objective data point in connection with the progress that's been realized. And beyond that, what I would say is that we're all about continuous improvement. And in addition to making improved utilization of the resources that I previously mentioned, we want to do it in a way that is respectful of our operators in terms of the dose that they receive, the ergonomic challenges that they might experience, the ease of administration of the record keeping that's vitally important here as well. So all of those pieces work together. The precise timing of when capital construction project improvements come into play and how they interrelate to variations in mission need and so forth makes it difficult to give predictions. What I'm confident in conveying to you is that whatever the circumstances that we face, we're committed to make the most of it in terms of minimizing the MAR in the facility at any point in time.
Thank you for that. I would like to follow up on the 60% MAR reduction that was quoted since 2009. Could you provide some insights on how much of that reduction was attributed to what I call a physical change, such as repackaging the material into a certified container or relocating the material into a more robust configuration versus, let's say, an administrative change where by analysis you are determining that the material the consequences of the accidents could be reduced by looking at the existing container, whether it's credited or not. Can you talk about
Sure.
a breakout?
It strikes me, and forgive me if I take just a minute to describe the concept of material at risk a little, because we're now getting into some subtleties here. Material at risk is a descriptor of how likely material is to contribute to a consequence to human beings in an accident scenario. And so the form of the material and the method in which the material is stored or contained is relevant to that determination. For an example, just for folks, if there was material in a ball mill as a process that was in very fine powder, that would be the kind of material that would contribute significantly to material at risk. It's in a form and it's outside of a well-established confinement system because it's in a ball mill that would contribute to an accident. You take that same material and put it in an engineered container. It's still finely ground powder, but it's in a container that would be robust. It contributes less to an accident, so it's less material at risk. You could also take that material and change its form so that it could be larger, solid pieces of metal rather than finely ground powders, and the larger pieces of metal are inherently less likely to contribute to a public consequence. But then the best thing you could do is just have it be gone entirely, right? If you didn't need it and it was gone, it wouldn't be there at all. So all of those factors affect material at risk, which is what we're talking about here. Our approach to safety at PF4 and everywhere else is that if we aren't assured of the reliability of a control, then we conservatively presume that the control doesn't exist at all, right? Right now, we conservatively assume that our active ventilation system fails in a significant earthquake. If we have an uncertified container, if we have, it looks like a good container, but we haven't studied it, we assume it doesn't have any particular value to us at all. So we give it a damage ratio of 1. We assume it releases all of the material. Now, if we take that same facility, that same container, and we invest in a R&D process, and we actually have it tested, and we drop it from heights with surrogate materials in it, and we put it in a fire, or we crush it, or we hit it with an object, and we get real data on how the container performs, so that we now have surety rather than being unsure, we can credibly say that that container has value to us from a safety perspective, and we reduce that number called damage ratio. So in the last few years, we've had a very concerted effort to do two things: to put material in containers that are certified. We have a very robust program to implement new containers. And we've taken the time and effort and the energy and the resources to go and test the containers that we already have. Sometimes we find out that the container isn't very good, and then we use the research and development capabilities of the laboratory to design a new container. We've done that, for example, for heat source plutonium. Sometimes we're lucky enough to find out that the container we designed at the beginning is actually fairly robust, and then we take appropriate credit for it. I'm happy to say that we did a good job designing many of the original containers, and so that after that more rigorous analysis, we've concluded that we can take credit for them. So a sizable amount of our reduction in material at risk over the last few years has been because we have gained confidence in the containers that we use, rather than moving the material out. As you well know, that our efforts at Los Alamos to actually move material out of Los Alamos have been significantly focused on what's called Area G, right, the waste storage areas.
I'd like to add that Los Alamos has been utilizing some very robust containers. We call them the Savvy 4000 containers, and that's just been in the last 6 years. So they're very, very robust. It doesn't mean the other containers are bad, but these are newer design, very robust. They go through a series of tests to make sure they can withstand different types of insults. And so I think it's a great addition to the nuclear material management program that we have at the site to incorporate some of these new containers.
I guess there's almost a little bit of bragging here that Los Alamos has designed these containers, and they're now at use across the entire enterprise. So all of the Department of Energy is benefiting from enhanced safety due to these Savvy 4000 containers that were designed here at Los Alamos.
Thank you. A follow-up question to Mr. Kasich. Another opportunity is the use of the vault. Can you talk about some of the initiatives to improve utilization of the vault and talk about what the vault can do to further reduce risk?
Sure. So certainly it starts with the fact that material stored there is in a very safe location relative to other places within the facility, given the various accident scenarios that we need to postulate and analyze. And it's a complicated decision-making process, starting with, again, out of recognition of the importance to the workers. It's an area where the dose that one worker would take on with spending time there is notably greater than other places in the facility. So we want to be judicious with sending people in there for that purpose. Then, with respect to what materials have what purpose, immediate term or longer term, is a consideration. The completeness and availability of the criticality, safety evaluations that need to be in place, whether or not workers are trained to those. So there's a lot of parameters that need to be assessed in aggregate in order to take full advantage of that. It's also not a facility that we want to fill up and seal because the nature of the work there requires a movement and manipulation at varying periodicities. And so perhaps that's not as precise an answer as you might have been seeking, but those are some of the considerations that govern what we do and don't put in the vault.
And my last question is, what other measures are you considering to implement some of the risk reduction in addition to the containerization, the vault? Any additional measures you're considering?
Well, I think we've touched on most of the improvement opportunities that we avail ourselves in from the standpoint of what material we have and how can we put it in as safe as condition as possible. And certainly in the discussions during the first panel, there was considerable discussion about the improvements from safety systems. So I think it's the two of those jointly that bear on the fact that over time we have improved materially and intend to do so in the future.
So I'd like to ask a question now, and I'm going to ask it of either Ms. Liebeck or Mr. Thompson, whoever wants to field it, but it has to do with material that's categorized as having no defined use. So for the benefit of the public, we've been talking a lot tonight about material at risk, and as opposed to material in the building that's not considered at risk. And I think Mr. McConnell just a few moments ago took a few minutes to explain what that meant. But you take all that same material and then there's another descriptive categories that all of that material is broken into, regardless of whether it's at risk, which is that which has defined use and that which has no defined use. And the most recent material management plan that was produced here shows that about 40% of the material that's in the facility is categorized as no defined use. So I'd like to first ask you if you could just explain a little bit about what that means, and then perhaps how you validate whether or not material has a defined use or not.
So thank you for the question, sir. I'll start, and I'm sure Ms. Liebeck will correct me or add to it. So first of all, the program needs that we have are very exacting in terms of material that we require for our stockpile. And to first order, defined use in large measure deals with material that is of the right purity and specification for our use in the stockpile. If something is deemed not, has no defined use, let me back up and say defined use material essentially has no time limit. Once we determine that we have material that is good for future applications, we tend to hold on to it because we have very little capacity in this country to make more. So that's on the defined use side. As you mentioned earlier, there's a large percentage, I think it's 40% is what you said, is in PF4 that doesn't have a defined use. A lot of that material is either contaminated in some way. It may be plutonium with uranium components, other contaminant materials that make it less desirable for our mission work, in which case it requires some level of either containerization or processing to dispose of or to take to a final disposition. We have, as was said a couple different ways in the first panel and in this one, we have an issue with waste processing overall in the system, particularly with the WIP situation and how that evolves. So we are somewhat limited in our ability to move no defined use waste to that final disposition status. In some cases, we would return some of the material that sits in the PF4 vault today back to places like Savannah River or Y12 where they could be further processed to its final end state. But all those things are really predicated on whether or not the program can use the material in some future application before we make that determination.
Sure. The material recycle and recovery program is about a $60 million a year investment for Los Alamos Lab. So we are able to fund from the NNSA level, a sizable sum for the lab to work with material. So they containerize it, or right now we're going through a readiness process where the laboratory is desiring to start up the aqueous chloride line, and so they want to resume that operation. It was one of the operations that was paused back around the 2013 timeframe. So we are attempting to get through that process right now. It's a readiness process where we make sure that the people, processes, and procedures are in place so they can resume that line. So that's one avenue where they can take material and put it into different forms, possibly extract americium out of that as a viable byproduct of that line. And then we can also generate waste. And so as we've said in the earlier panels, with WIP just reopening in December of 2016, we hope to be shipping waste here by the end of the fiscal year. That's an aggressive schedule. It's our plan to open a new transuranic waste storage facility on site. So right now we have waste that we're storing at the PF4 facility in the TA55 area. And so when we when we open the new facility, we can take waste out of the plutonium facility in the vicinity, put it in the new storage facility, and at the same time, we are preparing to ship to WIP, hopefully by the end of the fiscal year, that's an approximate date. So that's another avenue that is available to us, and we're going through all those technical processes right now. So another activity going on at the national level is the ARES program, and so our national leaders need to determine if there's going to be mixed oxide fuel project at one of our other sites, and if we're going to pursue other options for disposal of material. So we do have the ability right now to put material in newer containers. We can resume processing of the aqueous chloride, and then we have the true waste option of disposal at WIP right within reach.
Mr. Thompson, I'd like to follow up. You talked about if there's material that it is known that it could be used in a program, then it's a defined use. And if I understood you correctly, you sort of do that conservatively because we're not making any more plutonium.
Yes, sir.
So to use an analogy, if I had a certain type of special motor oil that I use in my automobile, then that would be defined use for my automobile. But if I had 100 cases of it, then I couldn't reasonably use it all because the vehicle won't last that long.
Right.
So do you analyze for that sort of scenario in terms of trying to make a good faith estimate of what realistically might be used as opposed to what might be excess?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question and the follow-up. One of the aspects of this we haven't talked about yet is the idea and actually the premise behind an economic discard limit, which primarily we use both at Los Alamos and Y-12 for uranium and plutonium. So in those cases where we have material that might be useful to future mission need, we go through an economic analysis to say, what would it take to purify the material and what benefit would that yield versus how much would it cost, how much time it would take to do that, and whether or not we have the facilities even to do that. So that factors into essentially what may stay in a defined use category or drop into the no defined use. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So I guess I'll just ask if you're confident that we don't have a scenario, say here at PF4, that would be analogous to my 100 cases of motor oil scenario. Is that
no, sir.
Statement?
We have, although there is a lot of material that is available for future mission use, I would not say that we have a 100-case motor oil situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I wanted to follow up with Ms. Liebeck because you talked about the problems at WIP and how that is holding up being able to dispose of some of this material that is no defined use. But is there material in the building which can't go to WIP, which doesn't have any disposition path identified at all? Do you have some of that?
Yeah, yes, we do have some material that does not have a currently identified disposition path at this point.
Okay, so and what would you say is the overall NNSA strategy? PF4 is not a permanent repository itself, so someday it has to go somewhere.
I agree. I mean, we do have some items that have uranium content and other items, but we know what we have, and they don't contribute greatly to our material at risk because of their current composition. So we just need to work with the laboratory and our counterparts with headquarters and keep working on this issue. I mean, it's been it's been an issue in the complex for several years, and I think we've made substantial progress on it, but there are still what we refer to as cats and dogs that we, don't have the defined pathway for at this point.
The other thing I would add too, just to that, is not only is it the composition of the material that is stable, but we also prioritize those things because we know we're going to be hanging on to them for some period of time before the final disposition is determined, that they're in the highest secure locations in the facility and in the appropriate containers as well.
Is there any specific review that's done on any periodic basis to say where this, at a high level, this material is looked at in order to try to determine a path forward, as opposed to a scenario where, okay, it's out of sight, out of mind, and we've just got other things to do, and decades from now we might come back and have the very same discussion. Do we have a review that's done rigorously at some periodicity to try to determine a disposition path for these materials?
We have data calls periodically for this type of material, and it's a different part of our headquarters organization, but we do catalog the information, we provide it in a periodic report, and I know there are meetings. I can't say the periodicity of the meetings, but there are teams that work on this over time.
I would just add too that not only are there periodic reviews, as Ms. Liebeck mentioned, but I think a lot of times we have very situational dependent at every site that has large capital investments to make. Part of that process that we mentioned earlier in terms of modules in the future and potential AOA alternatives that might come out of that. That kind of discussion and breadth of comprehensive analysis drives a lot of that, because we don't want to necessarily pay for high rent space inside PF4 for an indefinite period of time when we know that space is precious to us for program reasons. As we ramp to product in the mid-20s, for example, that's going to take that amount of material in pit production is going to take more space, and so we're looking much harder because of that at the materials that are in this status.
All right, so, and if I was interested in more information, just trying to figure out the decision-making process, who is responsible for this? Who would I ask that question of?
The person responsible is the material recycler and recovery manager that works for me, so it would be through me.
Okay, thank
Sir.
you. All right, Mr. Santos, I believe you have the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus some more on the option of the transuranic waste and all the waste management aspects and the challenges there as they relate to risk reduction initiatives. So some of the non-defined use material within the plutonium facilities is destined to be dispositioned as transuranic waste. You all have listed some of the challenges. I'm just going to repeat it for the benefit of the question. Area G, it's not accepting new waste. the transuranic waste facility is in the process of starting operations, but it is my understanding that currently it won't be able to accept the majority of the transuranic waste from the plutonium facility. As you know, the majority of the operations at the plutonium facility were paused for multiple years due to conduct of operations and criticality safety issues. So when those facilities resume, new generated waste is going to probably be staged at the plutonium facility. And much uncertainty exists regarding the near-term rates of waste disposal and the timing to go to the waste isolation pilot plant. Can you please discuss the impact of this impaired waste system on the risk reduction activity which tends to, disposition as transuranic waste?
I'll take the first shot at that, if you don't mind. So first of all, I think it's a good news story that the WIP has reopened and they're beginning to receive shipments from around the complex. I think that's great news. We also have a brand new $107 million transuranic waste storage facility ready to come online. Our goal is September-ish to receive waste in that facility, and it can handle up to 1,250 drum equivalents. So it's several buildings at that facility, and this project has been in the capital line item space for several years, and so I'm happy that we're going to be able to use that facility in the very near future. We still have our processes we need to go through to make sure things are ready, and we will do that. We're in the process of doing that right now. The lab is conducting their readiness review, and that'll be followed by a federal review, and the headquarters will give approval to actually start that facility up. So in the meanwhile, we have worked with the New Mexico Environment Department, and we do have some waste stored out on some of the pads at Tech Area 55. We want to minimize that storage on the pads, and when we can get into this new facility and get into resuming waste shipments to WIP, we think that some of the pressures in the facility will be alleviated because we'll have the ability to go stage in the new facility and then ultimately ship to WIP. So I think all that's very good. I also think that since the pause in 2013, we've brought up several of the activities that were paused. These activities require about 3 levels of review. This is once the laboratory decides they want to bring a process back up, they do a management, what we call a management self-assessment, and then they do a readiness activity, and that's followed by a federal readiness activity. And we probably brought 7 processes back up, so that's over 20 reviews that's been conducted on some of the processes in the facility in the last year and a half. And when we do these reviews, the laboratory uses people at the lab, and they draw on their parent company resources to bring in those outside eyes. And for the federal reviews, I use my staff, and we also bring in some of the feds from the other sites, and oftentimes from our headquarters locations as well. So this is a good opportunity to work with the laboratory, work with different entities, bring outside eyes in to look at the operation. So I think bringing these operations back up, presumably they will generate more waste, but we are right at the cusp of being able to open that pipeline again for getting waste outside of the Tech Area 55. And our DOE environmental management colleagues are now in charge of Area G, and there's always an opportunity there where we could dialogue with them in the future and see if there might be any additional capability there, but we actually are bringing online this new facility, which will be very helpful in this process.
Thank you. A follow-up question to, I'm sorry, Mr.
I was just going to add a little bit to Ms. Liebeck's answer, and it speaks a little bit more to a process and the area of attention that we have at the laboratory that's been on the rise of late, and to your question of risk reduction and risk management. And in this particular instance, it's quite germane that we have a separate site office for environmental management, and I'll say the premium that it places on kind of a site-wide or enterprise-wide look at the issue as opposed to a more territorial one. And in fact, just last month, we convened the first meeting of a new group that we constituted with the goal of making sure that we had all the parties who have a role to play to optimize the solution going forward in attendance, and work is continuing on from there. So I'm just adding to her answer in the sense that process-wise, with the additional complexity of a separate site office and soon a separate contractor, the best decisions require an integrated look at that, and we have some improved institutional process in place to try to leverage that.
Thank you. That's actually a good leading to the question I would like to ask to Mr. Thompson. It's like, could you explain what arrangements have been made to ship newly generated waste from PF4 to WIP, and what priority is given to this waste from PF4 compared to the other waste across the entire complex?
So thank you for the question. I don't know if I'm the best one to answer, but I'll ask. I think I'll ask Jim to jump in. Thanks.
So we're very, very pleased that Los Alamos ended up being one of the 4 initial priority sites that the Office of Environmental Management and the National True Waste Program identified as at the front of the list to resume shipments to WIP, along with sites such as Idaho and Oak Ridge and Savannah River. It is a very encouraging thing that Los Alamos is on that list. There are other sites that are still waiting to resume shipment. Now we have work to do between now and the end of the fiscal year to get to the point where we can demonstrate to ourselves and to the folks in Carlsbad that the processes we use and the waste that we're going to ship to them will meet all of their expectations and all of the waste acceptance criteria. We are not, Los Alamos is not planning to be one of the larger of the, actually is the smallest of the 4 sites that are currently identified to begin shipping. And so sooner or later, the obvious answer is that we're going to need to increase the capacity of the entire enterprise to dispose of waste at WIP in order to bring in those other sites that aren't currently on the priority list, and also to increase the amount of shipment that we do from here at Los Alamos so that we can more rapidly draw down the true waste that we have generated and stored, and eventually get to the point where we ship waste to WIP at a rate that is greater than or equal to the rate at which we generate it. And as you heard, our mission scope is going to be increasing over the next few years, and that will inherently mean that if we generate more transuranic waste when you make 30 pits a year than you do when you make 10 pits a year. So we're going to need to continue to work collaboratively with our friends in environmental management in order to make sure we can get that done. There are a lot of people in the enterprise who wish they were in Los Alamos' spot and at least has a path open right now to begin shipping.
So my last follow-up question, thank you for that, to Ms. Davis-Liebach, is can you describe some of the activities that you need to do to get ready to ship, and when will we expect that to happen?
Okay, we have a DOE order, which is one of our basic requirements. It's called 425, DOE Order 425. It's nuclear facility readiness, and we need the laboratory to make sure that they have gone through their processes, make sure we have looked at any safety documentation, we've looked at training, we've looked at can the people execute the procedures that they've written and do the work absolutely safely. And so first the laboratory goes through a process and they determine, what level of readiness that they believe is required per our DOE directives. Then we collaborate at that point and make sure we agree that yes, it's it's this type of review or maybe a more stringent review. And we have to have the place to actually make these shipments from. And so as the board has been very apprised of our facility called Rant, which has historically loaded the TruPack containers, we've had a seismic issue that was identified. You know, we've worked with you on that. We've had periodic briefings on the Rant facility, and so we plan to do the loading operation at TA 55. So we have to develop a process, you know, make sure our safety documents are proper and we have all the components of the readiness process done at the laboratory level. Then the federal personnel come in and do the appropriate reviews. And so a lot of times that involves an active demonstration of what the lab intends to do. So in the case of shipping to WIP from TA 55, they brought in, they demonstrated the capability with the trucks and what have you in 2016. Our readiness requirements talk about recent and relevant demonstration of the activity. So we worked with the laboratory. We said we probably need to do this again. It's 2017, so we are going to start that process here soon. So we also have to work very closely with the Office of Environmental Management. They have a schedule, a rolling schedule. We need to make sure we're on the rolling schedule, and all that has to converge nicely, you know, in the next several months. But at the same time, we're going to be going through the readiness on the new True Waste facility so we can move waste from TA 55 to the new facility and stage it there until such time it can go to WIP.
That's a lot. So when is your expected date to ship to WIP?
I mean, this is early fall is our plan.
2017?
Yes, early fall is what we're planning to locally.
Thank you. No more questions.
Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to discuss life cycle planning, and I'd like to address the questions to Mr. Thompson, please. Some NNSA programs have not always planned for the complete cradle-to-grave life cycle of the nuclear materials and waste generated as part of their mission, and that's required by DOE order on nuclear materials. Can you tell us what actions have been taken to assure that the program complies with this requirement moving forward?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I don't know if there's any specific action I can point to that would state that we're now following the order that we potentially haven't been in the past. I would say it this way. In facilities, particularly at Los Alamos, since we're talking about plutonium facilities, that has been the case where facility programs occupied certain parts of the facility, and their funding was truncated virtually in one cycle unexpectedly, and the rest of the programs in the facility were required to essentially pick up the slack in terms of the care and feeding of the facility going forward. As a matter of practice, that has only happened a couple of times in my memory in the last 20 years or so in PF4. For the most part, I think we do, in fact, that is an anomaly to what is standard practice of following the DOE expectations for life cycle planning. So that's not to say we haven't had it in the past, but it's typically anomalous in regards to funding continuity from Congress.
If I could add one thing, that certainly this is consistent with RCRA, and that the generators are responsible for the disposal and for the management. One of the things we've been very explicit about, both the laboratory and the feds, is that undeniably we have sometimes in the past generated waste that was not compliant with our disposal paths, which is why we have some problematic waste now. We have made a commitment that will not occur anymore in the future. We will not put waste in the new transuranic waste facility that is not compliant with the disposal requirements. We are not going to, and if perchance we were to find out that something changed, that is the obligation to go back to the generator, which in this case would be at PF4. And so it is knowing that the generator would have to upset their program and their process in order to accept a drum back into the facility to repackage it or whatever the case may be, is a pretty significant deterrent against creating that non-compliant drum in the first place. And so now that we've been very adamant that our new TRU facility is not a place to put problems, it's a place to temporarily stage compliant waste on its way to WIP, is a very important thing we've communicated to all of the generators.
And I think you addressed this, but just to make sure I understand, I'm trying to understand how you're going to account for increased waste generation rates as your mission and production rates increase. Is there something specific or a specific example you can give me of how you're going to address that problem as the rates increase?
That is as I just alluded to, that is a national level issue to get the disposal capacity of WIP up to the point where it is suitable for the demands not only at Los Alamos but of all the places across the enterprise, both in NNSA and the rest of the department that generate transuranic waste. So clearly we have to come together as a largest community. Our laboratories, other laboratories like the Savannah River National Laboratory and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and others that have an interest in this to help us figure out how to best attack this national laboratory level problem. On our part, what we have to do is figure out how to optimize the storage and the packing of waste so that we can ship as much of our waste as possible in whatever shipments we are allocated. One of the challenges we have right now with this overall system is that sometimes we can find ourselves limited by, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but there are many, many different attributes that have to be satisfied in order to have a compliant waste that can go to WIP. And sometimes the attributes that are limiting for us are not how much material at risk is in the package. And so we end up shipping things that have less material than we would like, but they are bouncing up against some other limit. So we have to figure out how to optimize our waste so that we get more effect per TRU pack.
Okay, thank you. No more questions, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Connery.
So again, thank you for your time on this panel, and I'm going to introduce a different line of questioning, a critical one. In 2013, the laboratory director paused all plutonium facility programmatic operations due to identified deficiencies with the Nuclear Criticality Safety Program. And just in 2016, the annual report from the DOE's Nuclear Criticality Safety Program was submitted to us, and it indicated that LANL's Criticality Safety Program remains non-compliant in several areas and does not meet expectations. So my question will start with you, Mr. McConnell, and if you could tell us what the rationale and the basis for reaching that conclusion on the Crit Safety Program here at LANL.
Thank you very much. I'd be happy to. As you know, I was one of the people that signed that report. What we did in this report was to make sure we communicated, and it isn't just Los Alamos, and it isn't even just NNSA, it's all of the defense nuclear facilities that have the potential for criticality in whatever program office they might reside, reports to the safety board. And the most recent report describes each location in terms of its absolute position relative to our expectations and requirements. So while Los Alamos is making very good progress in improving they aren't done improving yet, which means that they are still below our requirements. And so the adjective the color we applied to that was that they're red. We have a requirement, and while they are improving, they haven't achieved that requirement yet. So we gave them the one and only red rating of all the sites that were reported in that issue. There were sort of three main reasons we had to do that. First off is we have concerns about the number of people at the laboratory who have this very unique skill set to do criticality safety. And while they're making very significant improvements here at Los Alamos, the number is still less than we wanted. They added 5 people, and in this area 5 is a lot last year, hoping to add 6 this year. So they're making pretty substantial improvements in staffing this function. The second problem was that there are areas of the facility, or there are operations or things where the criticality safety evaluation, this very unique and rigorous analysis that has to go in to demonstrate that under certain circumstances and controls, the likelihood of an inadvertent nuclear criticality is sufficiently and extremely low. Some of our operations have analyses that are not as complete or robust or as well constructed as our current expectations. I can't give you the number, but there are hundreds of these evaluations for the activities at TA-55. And so the laboratory has a commitment to both maintain the analyses necessary for all the new work that's coming down the road, but they also have to go back and work off this backlog of legacy analyses to improve their content and their quality. And they're making progress on that, but they still have numerous places and numerous activities that have old analyses. And in some cases, we go to the extreme point of saying that you are not allowed to use that operation until you get a new analysis. And so we just disallow operations until we get a new one. The third thing is we have areas of the facility that the term we use is infracted. There's something about the actual activity that is sufficiently different from what we assumed or analyzed or require that we say, okay, you are not in compliance with the criticality safety. And some of it can be, for example, one of the things we've come across is that we had in the past, from a design perspective, given the designers of containers and things nominal dimensions. Right? Make this container about this size. But for criticality safety, we have to assume some specific dimensions. And so now we have to go back and say it's not good enough to just specify nominal dimensions. We have to specify either minimum or maximum, something that allows us to do bounding analysis. We're working through those. Los Alamos is working through those. The last plan that I had seen anticipates that as much as 90% of those infracted conditions might be addressed this fiscal year. I'd be happy if that were the case. But in the meantime, we will conservatively address those operations and limit what we do or allow so that we know we're safe from a criticality safety perspective. I guess in summary, I would say that progress is good. If I were to rate them in progress, it would have been a better color. But the truth is that absolute value is they aren't where we need them yet, and they don't believe they're where they want to be yet. And we expect that to happen soon.
So if I might contribute to the answer, in varying ways, virtually all of the panelists have talked about the imperative of safety in everything that we do. I don't think there's a more profound demonstration of that other than how you started your question by saying that the director paused operations in the one and only facility of its kind because of the lack of confidence that in the ability to operate it safely. So notwithstanding what Mr. McConnell articulated, and I don't disagree with a word of it, this is an area of high attention to the laboratory as it has been for some time. And notwithstanding the red color, the current configuration with respect to the laboratory's viewpoint is that it is safe and it is getting better, and it's only a matter of time before we achieve the standards that both we and the department expect.
Well, I appreciate your optimism.
If I wasn't clear about that, I want to make sure I'm absolutely clear. The things that the operations that we actually, Ms. Lieback actually allows to, and the laboratory allow to go on an operation activity by activity basis have to meet our standards. We would not allow the work to go on if they didn't meet our standards. There are some things where we don't allow work right now because they don't meet our standards, and that set, because that set exists, we put out the metric that you alluded to.
I appreciate the fact that you were willing to come out and call it red. You talked about the hiring that has been done. You've also lost 6 criticality specialists in the past 12 years, and if you're replacing them with people with less years of experience, that's certainly not an equivalency if you replace 6 for 6, and I know that you appreciate that. It is a crucial area for you to be able to move forward. Even you talked about the vaults and being able to put material in the vaults, so you need to have that crit calculation done to do that. So it is hampering you in addition to being a safety challenge. So I guess, having gone through this in 2013, are there any lessons that you have taken from 2013 that you're applying now in order to be able to ameliorate this problem?
One thing to note here, the skill set is kind of at a premium across the complex. And so when we receive, or the laboratory hires 5 new people, we're basically cannibalizing from other sites. And if our folks leave, then they're probably going to another one of our sites. So the laboratory petitioned us to work with them on some retention programs for the crit safety analysts. And we did that. We said this is extremely important. It's a finite number of people with a specialized experience, and we work with the lab, and we approved a program that they asked for our approval on through the contract, and then they gave it some runtime, and it still wasn't yielding the desired results. So they came back to us a second time and said, we want to revamp the program. It's not having the desired effects. And so at that time, they also included some of the safety basis positions, which is another kind of unique set in the Department of Energy. And so safety basis analysts are often, moving around, and it's a long training program, and to get the people with some experience and the requisite training, it can take a while. So anyway, we worked with the laboratory and approved that recently for some of the crit analysts and the safety basis analysts. The laboratory's also looking beyond just, cannibalizing from other sites and this retention program, and they're starting to work with a handful of the universities and to try and, grow the skill set indigenously from the universities. So, Rick, I don't know if you want to jump in, but definitely we've tried to work this issue, hand in hand, because it's a valuable skill set for these analysts, and we require them for our work.
So I'll just add, and I'll start with acknowledging the high validity of your initial comment about the fact that it's not just people, but they need to be capable of doing the work that we need them to do. And so in addition to what Ms. Lieback covered, beyond the raw numbers of people that we have, the other opportunity we're in the midst of exploiting is improving the efficiency of the work they can do. So some of these infracted cases that Mr. McConnell just talked about we're going to have a much more efficient way where a small number of analyses will encompass a large number of infracted cases. So that's the other lever that we're using to improve the ability of our existing workforce, or whatever size it has, to contribute to improving the scorecard that Mr. McConnell summarized.
If I just might add one more thing, this is a broad problem. I mean, I've told my rising college senior that if he wants job security and a high-paying job, he might want to think about becoming a criticality safety analyst. So we need people for Los Alamos. We need people for Oak Ridge. We need federal people to do this work, and it's all the same pool. And so what we really need to do is increase the overall size of the pool. Now, thankfully, due to some previous recommendations of the board from the last decade, we have a nuclear criticality safety program, which is run out of my office, where we annually spend a few tens of millions of dollars to make sure we sustain a criticality safety hands-on training program to both train the new analysts at a very deep level, but also to get appreciation of first-line supervisors, managers. Certainly our staff goes. I think that some of your staff, perhaps even some of you, have attended some of our training at the more awareness level. That is necessary in order to increase the overall pool of this very critical resource, so that the entire department spends less time just trying to hire away each other's experts.
Well, the chairman's giving me the hook, but I just want to say that I do appreciate the fact that we're cannibalizing across the sites, and I think I might have stolen one of your crit and safety specialists recently. So.
That does come to mind.
The former head of the program I just talked about.
But I would say that it would be maybe helpful to consider whether or not you should come up with a pool of specialists that could be deployed across the sites in case of a critical need in a future time.
Okay, we promised the public they'd get their chance at 8:30, and it's now 8:36. Mr. Santos, you're good? I would like to. Okay. All right, well then, I'd like to thank the panelists for patiently enduring our questions, and at this time, I'll give you a minute if you want to step off the stage before we begin the public comment section of this hearing. Okay, at this time, the board would like to provide an opportunity for comments from interested members of the public. A list of those speakers who have contacted the board was posted at the entrance to the room, and I have a list here where people have signed up. I'm going to read from that list just so that everybody has an understanding of who's on it and where they fall, if they're on it, where they fall in the sequence. And I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. So first is Jay Coughlin, second Tris DeRoma, number 3 Greg Mello, number 4 Chris Fischach, Fischahs, number 5 Scott Kovac, number 6 George Anastas, number 7 Marissa Naranjo, number 8 Anna Hansen, and number 9, Janet Greenwald. So to give everyone an opportunity, I ask that speakers limit their comments to 5 minutes. If there's additional time at the end, we will circle back and provide anyone else an opportunity to take up the extra time from what we have allotted. Remarks should be limited to comments, technical information, or data concerning the subject of this public hearing. Board members may question anyone providing comments to the extent deemed appropriate, and if there are any written statements, we'd be happy to accept those for the record. So with that, I'd like to ask the first speaker to come forward, and as each speaker comes forward, if you are representing a particular group or if you're simply representing yourself as a citizen of Los Alamos or citizen of New Mexico, then just please so state. So the first person is Jay Coughlin.
So I'm Jay Coughlin with Nuclear Watch New Mexico. First of all, I want to state my appreciation for the board. Thank you for this opportunity. And to illustrate how I'm aging, I've been following the board since the late 1980s, and your efforts are very much appreciated. Now I'm going to start by observing that in the the first half of the 1990s, the Department of Energy conducted what I considered to be a public relations campaign, claiming that pit production at Los Alamos would always be safe, and that PR program was caused or needed because of the notorious Rocky Flats plant. And it's only by good luck that Denver was not irradiated in a 1969 Mother's Day fire, and that the roof to Building 771 did not collapse. But I'm cynical and have grown more cynical over time about these proclamations that plutonium pit production would always be safe at Los Alamos. And I think that some of the past and recent events illustrate my point. The first thing I'm going to do is credit a former NNSA nuclear safety officer at the Los Alamos site office that was driven to become a federally protected whistleblower. It's the late Chris Steele. But for example, he pointed out how Los Alamos was still taking credit for the fire suppression system after the complete collapse of PF4 in the event of a severe seismic event. And then building from that, we have the recent fire of just a couple of months ago, which of course initially was played down in the public. Later, an ambitious or good reporter here came out with some of the details that pointed out that that fire was more serious than initially portrayed. We have the simple fact that PF4 was shut down for more than 3 years because of nuclear criticality safety concerns. And then I could offer more evidence, but I'll just close with the fiasco with WIPP that, as you all know, was generated or was caused by a radioactive waste barrel generated by Los Alamos. And all of this gives ample cause for concern about how safe future plutonium pit production will be at Los Alamos. Now, I want to be practical. I want to make some specific recommendations to the board, and I'll start with the easy ones and build up to the more difficult ones. But to begin with, I think the board should very much insist upon robust active confinement systems that will withstand the design basis earthquake. And Los Alamos and other NNSA sites have long had a history of resistance to that. But I admire the board's constantly sticking up for that very point and hope that you'll do so on into the future. Another recommendation, and this is something that has dismayed me over the years, but I will state that Los Alamos has gotten better. Like a decade ago, the lab was woefully behind on having updated safety bases. And as I said, they've gotten better. But I believe one of the most crucial things that you could do to protect both the occupational worker and the public is to verify that indeed the laboratory is absolutely up to date in its annual formulations of the safety basis. Let's see, my third recommendation, and again, I'm ascending to the more difficult recommendations. I think the board should be charged or somehow assume the charge to certify, and I'm suggesting a formal certification, that all nuclear safety or all criticality safety issues have been fully resolved. As you all know, these issues have been going on for years and prompted the multi-year shutdown of PF4. And there's actually some precedence for this certification actually being a required element. I'm going to credit my colleague, my fellow colleague, Scott Kovac, for pointing this out to me. But the 2009 Defense Authorization Act actually had a mandate that the Safety Board had to certify that the design of the CMRR at that stage was seismically safe. Now, I'm going to say some things that I know are beyond your purview, and obviously you all just can't self-declare that mandate. Congress would have to do it. But I hope we could have something similar to that situation back in 2009.
Mr.
Now-
Carl, you're at 5 minutes. Can I ask you to wrap up, please?
I will
very
wrap
quickly?
up with my most difficult suggestion. I urge you all to look at the proclaimed mission more closely. There's been a lot of talk about how mission drives material at risk. Now, I know I have to be brief. The legislation, Section 3113 of the 2015 Defense Authorization Act, mandating expanded plutonium pit production, was written by a staff member of the House Armed Services Strategic Forces Subcommittee. He's from Sandia. I will submit to you that much of this is the tail wagging the dog. It's rather convenient for the laboratory to have this congressional requirement. Furthermore, that requirement, I will close, Chairman. Furthermore, that requirement is to produce pits for the interoperable warhead that the Navy doesn't want. And
Right,
I know that
thank
because
you,
I have a
Mr.
Navy memo.
Thank you. We're at 6
All right.
minutes, and I'm going to like everybody else to come up, and if there's time, we can
I'll add
provide that
that
at the end.
I will.
Thank you very much.
We will submit written comments that'll be more comprehensive. But thank you again.
All right, thank you. All right, Tris DeRoma. Okay. All right, we'll move on. Then Greg Mello, who I know was not a mistake.
Yes. Good evening. Nice to see you all again, and thank you so much for coming out here.
And you represent?
The Los Alamos Study Group. I want to refer to Mr. Hamilton's onion, and I think that's where we should start. When we talk about the technical safety issues, we are at the outer layer of the onion. And we have, Jay has introduced the issue of the uncertainty about missions. I would concur with all that he said there. The missions which are driving these requirements at PF4 are contested and often disrespected by members of Congress, let's say. Jay said the Navy doesn't really want interoperable warhead number one. The Air Force has also said in meetings of the Nuclear Weapons Council that they don't really want the interoperable warhead either. I think I mentioned this to you guys in Washington. So we have no actual need to make pits. Not now, not in the foreseeable lifetime of the PF4 facility. Many people, knowledgeable people, talk about the lack of mission need for Ares. Ares is kind of a hobby horse, people say, and we would concur. Because MOX, the MOX project is itself its own little onion of, it's a self-licking ice cream cone of its own. The material purification processes at LANL with their associated, what was that, the economic limit, discard limit, all those are also contested, and the scale and intensity of those operations are also something that can be looked at. All told, Los Alamos PF4 suffers from a kind of a mission greed, you might say, which is fed from the congressional committees through the revolving door of personnel, as Jay mentioned, but it goes beyond that as well. NNSA as a whole, as GIO has said in many times, in many places, has much more mission than it has dollars to fulfill, but it's not just dollars, it's capacity, management capacity, its skills, as we've heard with criticality. Overall, NNSA, what we've heard here tonight, NNSA is looking to cut back somewhere. Their vast number of missions which are going forward have cost overruns, and they suddenly realize they're much more complex than they actually thought. So what we've heard here tonight is the first official public discussion of disinvestment in PF4. How we can cut back on safety class, fire protection, cut back on safety class, active ventilation system. We've heard that the seismic structural aspects of the facility are just fine. Well, I don't really think, Mr. Sullivan, I think you said last fall that that's not assured in your letter closing out one of your recommendations. Right now, there's confusion at NNSA. They don't exactly know what they want to do, or why, or how. What we see and hear here tonight is complexity and confusion. That's dangerous, and it will lead to fiscal waste and safety problems down the road. We also hear a lot of partial truths, euphemisms, evasions. Part of that is classification, but part of it is just because people don't know exactly what they're doing. So we've been around a long time. You know, my involvement with the site started in 1984. It's changing times and changing stories. In 1996, DOE said that Los Alamos could make 50 pits per year without investing anything in capital, any kind of capital expense and that's the basis of which Los Alamos got the pit production mission over Savannah River. The risks, let's see,
Mr. Mello, we are almost at 5 minutes.
Okay. We've heard about the rare design basis earthquake generating the design basis accident. It's unlikely to be that rare extreme accident that shuts down PF4 in the end. The problem will be a concatenation or ramifying compensatory measures and failure to invest in the facility as it should be invested in. There's always been, from the inception of the AEC all the way through, a tendency to run away from problems, disinvest, and build a new thing. And I submit that that's part of what we're seeing here tonight, because it gets very difficult. And I know I'm out of time. I appreciate your patience, and if there's time, I'd like to continue later.
Thank you. Right, next speaker is Chris Fishes. Hopefully will tell me how to pronounce his name.
Chris Fishes.
Fishes?
Yeah, resident of Los Alamos, New Mexico. Dear Chairman Sullivan and members of the Defense Nuclear Facilities Safety Board, my name is Chris Fishes, and I am here to speak as a resident and concerned citizen of Los Alamos, New Mexico. These views are not to be mistaken as the views of the Los Alamos Field Office and/or NNSA. Tonight, I am here to express my concerns with the low-level wastewater treatment facility under construction at Llanos Technical Area 50. The LLW treatment facility, LLW, is a defense nuclear facility and within your oversight responsibilities as I understand it. LLW is a new, less than hazard category 3 DOE nuclear facility which is being built to replace, in part, the 50-year-old radioactive liquid wastewater treatment facility where I worked for 5 years as a cognizant system engineer. When the original LLW design was put out for construction bid, it included installation of an ASME AG1 code on nuclear air and gas treatment compliant HEPA filtration unit in the building's exhaust ventilation system. HEPA filtration is used to filter airborne radioactive particulates from air prior to exhausting it outside as to mitigate the radiological consequences to the public, co-located workers, and the environment. I continue to believe that it is a sound and reasonably achievable engineering principle to install an ASME AG1 compliant HEPA filtration unit in the LLW exhaust ventilation system. Without it, there is no engineered control to remove radioactive particulates from the building air prior to it being discharged. This failure to maintain confinement of radioactive materials would appear to be contrary to any reasonably conservative design requirement, especially for a new DOE nuclear facility. The unfiltered exposure potential from LLW radioactive releases could be analogous to the consequences from WIP radiological release, whereupon Station 1 had 3 millirem. Installation of a HEPA filter unit in the nuclear facility's exhaust ventilation system would lower this public and worker exposure and release to the environment by 99 point. Thank you. And release to the environment by 99.97%. The efficiency rating of the HEPA filters for radioactive particulate removal. At approximately 1% of the total project cost, inclusion of a HEPA filtration unit on a $50 million plus facility to provide confinement of airborne radioactive materials appears to be a reasonable cost to protect the public, workers, and the environment. DOE Order 458.1, radiation protection of the public and the environment, requires the as low as reasonably achievable, ALARA, process to be applied to the design of facilities that expose the public or the environment to radiation or radioactive material. Obviously, this ALARA requirement applies to the LLW also. Failure to install a HEPA filtration unit in the LLW exhaust ventilation system would appear to be contrary and inconsistent to the ALARA process and principles. The ALARA process is also a Code of Federal Regulations requirement as defined in 10 CFR 835, Occupational Radiation Protection. Similarly, 10 CFR 830 Subpart A, Quality Assurance Requirements, requires the use of sound engineering principles and appropriate standards in the design of nuclear facilities. Elimination of the ASME AG1 nuclear filtration system from the LLW design would seem to be inconsistent with these CFR requirements. My recommendation, consistent with 10 CFR 830 and 835, DOE Order 458.1, and the lessons learned from the WIP radiological accident, I believe that installation of an ASME AG1 compliant HEPA filtration unit in the LLW exhaust ventilation system should be considered a reasonably achievable design feature. As such, I ask for your continued support in ensuring that consequences to the public, workers, and the environment from radiological releases from LANO's defense nuclear facilities, including its radiological nuclear facilities, are kept as low as reasonably achievable. If you have any questions regarding this concern, please let me know, and thank you.
And I timed you at 4 minutes and 58 seconds, so you get extra credit, Mr. Fishes. Thank you. Next on the list, Scott Kovac.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the board. My name is Scott Kovac. I'm with Nuclear Watch New Mexico here in Santa Fe. We support safe, monitored storage of radioactive waste as a matter of national security and environmental protection. However, this should not be interpreted as support for more nuclear weapons or pit production, nuclear power, or the generation of more nuclear waste. In our view, the best way to deal with the environmental impacts of nuclear waste is not to produce it to begin with. I'd like to have a summary of some of my suggestions here. First off is any expanded pit production schedule must prioritize health and safety over any hypothesized need for pits. We should have this hearing again in 2026 when all the buildings and all the remodels of the existing buildings at LANL that support pit production are complete. An active confinement ventilation system must be in place and working. Do not make any pits until all the safety programs are approved and operational, and until the vault and all the glove boxes are de-inventoried. The time for LANL to get away with we're working on it or we're making a plan are over. LANL has a long history of not following through on corrective action measures. And in addition to this, a new management and operating contractor for LANL will come into place within the next couple of years. we didn't talk about that today, but newer organizations will be inherently less safe as they get up to speed. There are 2 new radioactive waste facilities, the Transuranic Liquid Waste Treatment Facility Upgrade Project and the Radioactive Liquid Waste Facility must be complete and working before any new pits are made. Additional waste storage at TA-55 must not be allowed. I do appreciate your work on the active confinement ventilation systems. I looked it up. I went back to July 2005, where the board, and this is a quote from one of the weekly reports, the board clearly has stated its position that a reasonable upgrade of the existing active confinement ventilation system is the preferred safety class alternative. And again in December 2005, where the board stated the TA-55's dominant nuclear safety issue, which is the still open question on the effectiveness of the passive confinement strategy. So it's a shame that these systems, or these active confinement ventilation systems, are not funded. And so now they've gone back to, like, here's a report from January 2017, earlier this year, that notable out-year activities include identifying the totally seismic identify the totality of the seismic vulnerabilities that began in 2008 and an effective and the active confinement ventilation system. Back to completing all buildings and programs. There's a couple of things. The PF4 Equipment Installation Phase 1 sub-project, which is decommissioning and squeezing more capabilities into PF4, is not scheduled for completion until 2022. The PF4 Equipment Installation Phase 2 project, more of the same, not scheduled to be complete until 2026. These have to be finished before any pit production is started. The 2 new radioactive waste facilities, the Transuranic Liquid Waste Treatment Facility and the Radioactive Liquid Waste Facility, must be complete before any new pits are made. The Transuranic Liquid Waste Treatment Facility Upgrade Project is due to be complete in 2022.
Mr. Kovac, you're at 5 minutes. If I could ask you to wrap up, please.
Thank you. The Radioactive Liquid Treatment Facility due to be closed in 2018. And I'll just wrap it up by saying, the laboratory has plans and mentioned it even earlier today that they plan to store transuranic waste outside of TA-55. And so we can't allow that either. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is George Anastas.
Good evening. Welcome to New Mexico. My name is George Anastas. I'm a citizen. I'm a professional nuclear engineer registered in the state of California. I want to thank the staff for the report for this particular hearing, plus the report that they did, the staff issues paper dated July 2nd, 2013, Criticality Safety at Los Alamos. I'm going to address 5 points this evening, but I will follow up with a written statement for you all. First of all, I spent several days connecting dots regarding criticality safety at PF4. And I started Friday and I ended up Sunday afternoon just before the basketball game. I threw my hands up in the air. There were too many dots. One dot, several dots, really got me concerned. First of all, fire water intrusion into non-sealed containers would lead to a criticality. And I think the board can take some, make some recommendations regarding that. Second item is that there are a number of personnel violating posted quantities of special nuclear materials on carts and in glove boxes. That's a no-no. That's got to be one of the sacrosanct criticality issues that must be taken care of. Third item, they're probably, this PF4 is 30 years old, so I'm going to guess there are unknown liquids in discarded process equipment in the facility. I'm concerned about MUF, which is material unaccounted for in this in these pieces of equipment. Additionally, the numbers of the quantities of plutonium-239 are not given with any error bars associated with it. And in my experience in fuel fabrication facilities, you always have an error bar indicating the error in the particular measurement. So, in fact, if you look at material unaccounted for, material in discarded process equipment, there may be more than, I hate to say this, 1.8 metric tons of 239 on the first floor. That's a lot of plutonium. Next item is that Los Alamos makes good statements about the DSA. And I would recommend that someone independently not review the DSA, but review the assumptions in the DSA. One of the major problems with DSAs are that the proponent uses annual average meteorology. Well, there's no such thing in the real world as annual average meteorology. You should look at the worst meteorological conditions, the worst chi over Q in the parlance of a meteorologist, and use that in your accident evaluation rather than using average wind speed. Last item, then I'll shut up. And Mr. Chairman, you made the point, one earthquake in 10,000 years is an attempt using probabilistic risk assessment to say that what happened yesterday should not have happened within the next 10,000 years. PRA just says it's likely or it's unlikely. It can happen today, it can happen tomorrow, and PRA should not be used to provide a false sense of security, much like what happened at Fukushima with the underwater landslide and the tsunami, which hadn't occurred in 10,000 years or 1,000 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that was 4 minutes and 50 seconds, so you're going to give Mr. Fishus a run for most timely. Our next speaker is Marissa Naranjo.
Thank you. Ubiak gendi for shade tawe okidro apie kawe kia toa hapung korito na umu. Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Naranjo. I'm a tribal member of Santa Clara Pueblo, co-founder of our Santa Clara Pueblo Youth Council, and also a youth representative for the Communities for Clean Water. First, I'd like to say that I'm very disappointed and I think that it's highly disgraceful that the LANL admin that we're here today left before hearing all of our concerns and comments. And that it's that lack of personal accountability to the health and safety of our public and surrounding tribal communities that brought me here today to remind you all that we are here on Pueblo land. LANL has only been here for a little over 5 decades, and now there's an entire economy built off the exploitation of our people. It's extremely difficult to sit here and listen to LANL explain that the hazard mitigation actions they are taking for the possibility and probability of fires and earthquakes on our ancestral homelands. Knowing that there were already over 400 hazard waste violations in 2015 and over 100 in 2016. Every family in our community, my family included, has a member that has passed away as a result of cancer being exposed to the radionuclides that come from LANL. Both my great-grandma and my grandma died of thyroid cancer. Our air, water, and soil and our food has been contaminated, and our ancestral lands have been desecrated, and now they're talking about increasing pit production and the possibility of building new facilities. My greatest fear with regard to this whole issue is that if LANL isn't held accountable and told to stop, that it'll expand who knows how much. And that another 5 decades from now, another youth from our community will be standing up here trying to advocate for the health of our elders in our entire communities. So I urge you all just to help hold them accountable and stop what they're doing to us. We're some of the most vulnerable communities, and we don't have very much to stick up for ourselves. So please, please do what you can to help us.
Thank you for your comments. Our next speaker is Anna Hansen.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you very much for coming to our community. I support everything that has been said so far, and especially for our Pueblo brothers and sisters in their land, and especially for LANL leaving and not listening to the comments here. I am a Santa Fe County Commissioner. I am a member of the Buckman Direct Diversion. I am a former chair of Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety from 1999 to 2004. I have a long history with LANL. I have lived here for over 45 years. So I have watched what happened to our community for all of that time. As a county commissioner, my first concern is for our water and our people and being contaminated. LANL continually denies that there's poison in our water. I am concerned. That is a very real issue to me of plutonium in the Rio Grande. And even though it is a heavy metal and it falls to the bottom, and we have created a diversion plant and a diversion where we can stop the water coming in, there are still contaminants constantly coming off of that mountain. Not to mention the chromium plume that is not cleaned up, that is approaching San Ildefonso Pueblo land, probably has already moved onto it. So we have numerous issues that need to be addressed. Why are we building a plutonium facility, another one, and we should stop now on a mesa on the edge of a canyon with seismic and fire everywhere? This is like, does not make sense in any logical person's mind to have a plutonium facility that is in a place where there's known fire and known earthquakes. So as an elected official, and as a member of the Santa Fe County Commission, and that my county borders Lanel, I would request that you connect and talk to us more often. I have left my card with the people at the front desk. We want to be informed. I am grateful that you're here. You have at least addressed some of the issues that have happened in the last 40 years up there and have begun to make it a safer facility, but it's still not safe. When they talk about it's safe, those are words. Those are not actions. And what I want are actions. Yeah, I want to know that when a worker is on April 19th, a fire broke out in the plutonium facility. 3 workers placed the containment of unlabeled waste containers into a plastic bag. The mixture contained materials that spontaneously ignited when exposed to air. A fire ensued. 1 worker received second-degree burns in both hands after placing the bag into a metal container located on a metal cart. He pushed the cart toward the front of the room, away from the glove boxes where the plutonium is handled, and snuffed out the fire with a handheld fire extinguisher. You know that. But there have been other incidences that are not reported, and I can list them if you would like, but I'm sure that you know that because I am taking some of the stuff from your site. So we have growing concerns, you know, the basic chemistry at Lanel, the consequences, you know, with the fire and other issues. I am also concerned about Highway 599, which is the whip route through our community. That now has become populated with people because that's not advertised as a nuclear highway, and that's what it was built for, and it was built to take waste off of the mountain, and it needs to be protected, and that route was built by you, or the federal government, to protect us as citizens, and now development is continuing to happen there because it's a perfect opportunity without that being acknowledged. And I want that acknowledged. I want that information made aware. And as waste comes off of the mountain and off of the hill and along that highway, I want those drivers to be certified. I want them to be, you know, the highest quality and training.
Excuse me, Ms.
You're
Hand-
talking, okay, I'm sorry.
We're over 5 minutes, and so if you could please
Okay,
just
I
wrap up.
thank you. But I think I made a number of my points, and I will try and get this into writing. But I really appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for listening to all of us and hearing our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the final person who is on our sign-up list is Janet Greenwald.
Hi, I'm Janet Greenwald, and I'm co-coordinator of Citizens for Alternatives to Radioactive Dumping, or CARD. It's a very old group. It was founded in 1978. It's a grassroots group. It's statewide. In Albuquerque now, we're drinking quite a bit of plutonium. It's below regulatory concern, but it's above the amounts that are recommended by progressive physicists for the pregnant woman and the young child. My husband and I belong to the Heron Lake Sailing Club, and one of the co-members there was a man whose whole job was to trace the plutonium that comes from Los Alamos and enters the river, the Rio Grande. And he told us that not to worry because most of it precipitates out in Cochiti Lake. But there's no warning in Cochiti Lake. I hear people say all the time, I'm going sailing there, I'm going fishing there, I'm going, I don't know. It's our whole state is a case of environmental injustice when it comes to the nuclear industry. I raised my children in Dixon, New Mexico, which is directly downwind from Los Alamos. After the Cerro Grande fire, the New Mexico Environment Department came and said, there is cobalt in your plums and there is cesium in your broccoli, but not to worry because on the national average, you won't get enough to cause contamination. But you know, when you're living in the country and your broccoli comes in, you don't eat the average amount that the average American eats every week. You eat tons of broccoli. And shortly after, a couple of years after the Cerro Grande fire, one of my friends in Dixon died of cancer, and she was a vegetarian that only ate out of her garden. And now in the valley above there in Ojosarco, I have a young friend who's suffering from a nerve disease that sounds very like nerve diseases that I've run into workers in Rocky Flats. You know, there were more nerve diseases among Rocky Flats workers than there was cancer, even though there was lots of both. Up above Dixon in Ojosarco and the community above there, La Jolla, there's a large number of cancers. And there's a man up there who's documenting them. He tells me that 1 out of every 7 people now is dying of cancer up there. Also, the mountain lake up there has so much cesium around it that it's on the border of being an EPA site. We don't know that cesium came from Los Alamos because you can't fingerprint cesium, but it seems kind of obvious. Those lakes are directly downwind from Los Alamos and just a little above the elevation of Los Alamos. So also Dixon and that area is considered the organic farms of choice in New Mexico, the organic breadbasket, you could say. So my request is different citizens groups have tried to do monitoring in both Ojosarco and Dixon, and they just didn't have everything it took. And I feel that if there was some funding for monitoring in these downwind communities or down gradient communities like Santa Clara, that people might be able to sleep more easily at night. I'm constantly fearful for my grandchildren and my children who live in that area that I know has been contaminated. I mean, our Environment Department admitted it to us. I want to thank you for being concerned about our safety here in New Mexico. We see very little concern in the federal government. And as I say, I think the whole state at this point is an environmental justice area. And if there is any environmental justice, I'm hoping that someone will note that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So that completes the list of speakers who signed up. Is there anyone else in the room who has not spoken yet who would like the opportunity to speak? I see a hand over here and another one over there. So if I can ask those individuals, first this woman on the left and then the gentleman on the right. Please identify yourself, and I ask you to keep your remarks to 5 minutes.
Okay, give me the when it's 5. Okay, so my name is Kathy Wempovi Sanchez. I'm from San Ildefonso Pueblo. I'm not speaking for the Pueblo, but I am an employee of Table Women United, and I was going to submit a written comment, but then I'm compelled to just speak now too as well, because we are the most first impacted because Los Alamos was plopped into our sacred lands. And I would like to note that Los Alamos sits on a Jemez Plateau, which is at the rim of a dormant volcano. And I think it's just crazy that the continuation of a nuclear pit production facility sits on the rim of a dormant volcano, because there's still geothermal activities happening there. And because the storage area G has been located there since the onset, that the contamination has seeped into our aquifer, and so there is a plume there, and alongside the other area, and they're going to probably merge, or probably already have, is the chromium plume that is in the other canyon area. And in order to mitigate that, the intelligence of the lab is saying that they're going to frack the water out from there, meaning there's going to be active movement of supposedly taking out the upper layer of contaminated water and then cleansing it or cleaning it up enough to land applications of it, or either put it back into it, meaning that if nothing happens that is not connected to any other activities, meaning that if there's active movement of water that is being sucked out and sucked back in, you're creating a movement. And if you have seismic activities, you're already setting up the active vulnerability of tufa, which the plateau is mainly made out of concentrated ash from the volcanic activity. So you're not sitting on solid dirt, you're sitting on very porous material of ancient volcanic ash and wood burnings. And I've lived up in the Pueblo all my life, and I've seen 2 drastic fires that have come into the boundaries. And my question was that our native firefighters were the ones that had, the other firefighters pulled out of there because they knew the contamination of the fires was different. It had a lot of nuclear pollution materials in that fire, and it was glowing differently, and it heats up differently. So they left, and our native firefighters stayed. So then my question was, well, doesn't the lab even have its own firefighters? No, it's the state, and it's that is furnishing the firefighters, and they're volunteer. And because of those fires were being fought for the lab, and the lab wasn't permitting them to come onto the facility, there was that very moment of that fear and trauma that we face, that we could have had a nuclear catastrophe just there within 2 fires. And so I think the safety of the people, the vulnerability, also plays on that environmental justice of that trauma. Trauma that we're fearful, trauma that something is going to happen because there's human miscalculations, mishandling, inappropriate follow-through. The reports I've been watching and receiving is that it's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of safety on paper, but action, what is it? Actually the follow-through that they've done something about it. I haven't seen anything that says this was corrected by this action. It was corrected on paper, but still implementation has not been coming forward. So fire, the water, the contaminations, our people, our health. There's never usually a tie-in from issues with the lab and issues of the health impacts. I think they should both be connected, because once you can fingerprint the source of the contaminants, they are the ones that generate it, should be accountable for its cleanup. And a cleanup budget was cut, but the ramping of the production to 80 pits, that's insane. I think that's crazy. When you have only 6 and 8, and now they're saying, oh, we can handle 20, oh, we can handle 30, oh, we can handle 80. Money, money, money to produce, but not to clean up, not to demand that accountability. So I thank you for being a board that is about accountability. Thank you. Good.
Thank you. The gentleman over here on the other side of the room.
Thank you. My name's Antonio Maggiore. I am a county councilor in Los Alamos. However, I am not speaking here in my official capacity. I want that to be crystal clear. As I've sat and I've listened to all of this, and it's our The one thing that really, I am speaking into the mic. The one thing that really becomes crystal clear here is any action that you guys choose to take has to be properly and fully funded. Safety, security, all of these things do not come on the cheap, and I just encourage any decisions to be made that they be backed with full and complete sufficient funding, because you can't build safe facilities on the cheap, you can't do cleanup on the cheap, and budgets seem to always continually get cut or shortened or shrunk and try to work under a continuing resolution, and adequate funding is a must, not just for the lab, but for the safety of all of our surrounding communities. And as someone who represents Los Alamos, being able to look my fellow citizens, my fellow elected officials from the neighboring communities, being able to look them in the eye and know that I can be as direct and forthright and honest with them in saying we are doing what we can at a local level, but that means nothing if the backing and the support is not there at the federal level. So whatever you do, fund it fully.
Thank you. All right, is there anyone else in the room who has not had an opportunity to speak who would like to get up and address the board? All right, at this time, it's the clock is 9:31 and we had allotted till 9:35, so we do actually have a couple of extra minutes if anybody wanted to step up again. Is there somebody who wants to do that? I see Mr. Mello does. Anyone else? Mr. Mello, I'll give you 4 extra minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up where I left off. The problems of safety at Los Alamos are not going to be resolved permanently or successfully without addressing the excessive scale, complexity, opacity, and confusion. These are what trips up even the best managers in the situation. You could say that Los Alamos plutonium programs are ill from obesity-related diseases. It's not the fault of the existing managers entirely. It's a genetic defect that comes with the mission. Now, we heard reasons why the PF4 hazard mitigation has been slow, and they basically all were related to other LANL mismanagement issues. We have the WIP problem, which was created by Los Alamos. We have a transuranic waste facility, which was very long in coming and now has these serious problems, which Mr. Santos brought up. We have the radioactive liquid waste treatment facility, which is a saga that goes way back into the 1990s, where designs were pursued to the 90% level and then stopped by DOE, and then redesign began. We have the radioactive laboratory, utility, and office building. The budget for that is now $1.4 billion, way more in constant dollars than the Golden Gate Bridge. We've got the criticality problems which continue, which hold things back. We have the original vault design of PF4, in which there was a criticality calculation that was an error. There was the earthquake analysis that was used, Weston, I guess, was it? Anyway, it was substandard by the standards of the time. And now it's easy to look back and say, oh, well, that was inadequate then. It was inadequate when it was first done. We have the CMR, our nuclear facility, which was $500 million waste of money, and a decade. We have the CMR facility. They promised you they'd be out of that by 2010, then they promised by 2019, and now if you look in the details of the President's budget, it's pushed way out farther, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the exact date, but it's way beyond 2021. The plutonium storage facility was built and torn down. There was a vault built. Then when it was built for about $20 million, the upgrade was going to cost more than $100 million. So they eventually quietly bulldozed that. So there's a high level of institutional incompetence, and the contractor is paid for this, in fact, paid more for the mistakes. This is a hard problem, and so there's and if you look at what the actual product coming out of Los Alamos is and divide it by the money going in, compared to the Cold War, you've got, a factor of 20 or so times. Reporters do this. Senior managers at other facilities have joked about it. In fact, they say, don't divide by zero because I can't do that operation.
But Mr. Mello, we are out of time.
I appreciate your patience. Thank you very much, and appreciate your long-standing work to try to make this safe. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So at this time, we will have closing remarks of board members. I will start with some remarks from my own in my capacity as an individual board member. Then I'll turn to the other board members, and then I have some administrative comments at the end on behalf of the board. So we heard a lot of information tonight about what is a complex problem involving the plutonium facility. There's a lot of factors that NNSA has to take into account in order to try to manage the issues that were discussed here. And I don't mean to imply that I could do a better job if I was sitting in their shoes. Nevertheless, we are talking about a facility that is almost 40 years old and has an indefinite future life. There are some systems that have deficiencies. Some systems have parts that are obsolete. There was a previous plan to design and build a replacement facility that fell apart, and the next plan to build any new addition is several years away. They have problems disposing material in the building, and all of this occurs at a time when the programmatic mission work is slated to begin to increase significantly. So there is concern, and it is because of that concern that I came here tonight seeking answers to some questions, and I was appreciative of the fact that NNSA and the laboratory management here for the contractor did address the questions, and I also appreciated the information provided by the public, and I will take all that back with me as we try to plot a path forward at the Defense Board. So that concludes my remarks. Mr. Hamilton, do you have any closing remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any additional remarks.
Santos?
No additional remarks, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Connery?
No additional remarks at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the persons who were here, and including the public and the organizations who supported this hearing. Our goal for the hearing was to gather information regarding the National Nuclear Security Administration's strategy to ensure the hazard to the public and workers posed by storage and processing of special nuclear materials within the plutonium facility is safely managed now and into the future. Tonight we heard testimony from NNSA and the laboratory leadership team, as well as comments from the public. The board will consider the information gathered this evening to inform any actions that we may take regarding these issues. Once again, I thank everyone for their participation at this hearing. The record of this proceeding will remain open until July 7th, 2017. So members of the public who wish to submit further comments may do so until then. Would like to reiterate that the board reserves its right to further schedule and regulate the course of this public hearing, to recess, reconvene, postpone, or adjourn this public hearing, or to otherwise exercise its authority under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 as amended. This concludes the public hearing of the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. We are adjourned. Thank you.